a man suddenly discovers that his body keeps shrinking. Once a tall 1.9 meters, he slowly shrank to under 1.6. He even ended up a good bit shorter than his own wife. At first, Paul assumed he was just shrinking with age, and didn't pay it much mind. But as the days passed, his condition grew worse and worse. By now, he'd become even smaller than the family cat. The cat treated him as prey, chasing him around all day. For her husband's safety, his wife had to put the cat out of the house. Soon, Paul was too small even to climb onto the bed. His wife didn't dare share a bed with him, afraid she'd roll over and crush him. With no other choice, Paul had to move into his daughter's dollhouse. At first he found this life kind of fun, with no idea danger was about to find him. The cat that had been put out slipped back in through the cat flap. Startled, Paul stumbled and accidentally caught himself on a fish hook. The smell of blood instantly triggered the cat's hunting instinct. Paul quickly grabbed a pin to use as a weapon, but something that small could do no harm to the cat. To escape the cat's attack, Paul fell through a gap into the basement. He tried to call to his wife for help, but he was so tiny that she couldn't hear his voice at all. When his wife saw the cat back in the house, she immediately had a bad feeling. "Did you eat him?" Thinking the cat had eaten Paul, she chased it back upstairs. Paul could only watch his wife move farther and farther away. A feeling of despair wrapped tightly around him. He pulled over a scrap of cloth someone had dropped and wrapped himself in it. In the dust and the cold, he made it through his first completely forgotten night. The next morning, his daughter's shouting woke the sleeping Paul. Paul felt she might be the only person who could save him. He hurried to the foot of the stairs and shouted his daughter's name, but his voice was far too faint. In that vast space, not even an echo carried. He spotted a stub of chalk on the floor and quickly wrote his name at the stairs. But these letters, huge to him, were just an irregular scratch on the floor to a normal human. To replenish his energy, Paul remembered that a month earlier, he'd set a mousetrap in a corner of the basement. The cheese used to bait the trap was now the only food he could find. He lifted one of the nails and slammed it down on the trap's trigger. Luckily, the snap of the trap didn't hurt him. As Paul was eating big mouthfuls of cheese, a large spider behind him was slowly creeping closer. Luckily, before the spider attacked, Paul sensed the danger in time. He waved his weapon to drive the spider away. The spider, startled by Paul's sudden movement, turned and fled. After this crisis, Paul understood that even ordinary, unremarkable creatures, the kind you could kill with one stomp, could threaten his life. He needed to find a hiding place first to keep himself safe. He saw a large cardboard box not far off and used a nail to gouge an opening in it. Once inside, he plugged the opening back up with his tools. In this tiny space, Paul could finally sleep in peace. Over a dozen days quickly passed, but in all that time, neither his wife nor his daughter came down to the basement. It was as if Paul had been completely forgotten by them. The intense fear he'd felt at the start slowly faded. He stopped thinking about tomorrow. When hungry, he'd look around for something to eat. When tired, he'd lie down in the box and sleep. When in danger, he'd run. And when safe, he'd sit on the ground and wait for time to pass. Each day he thought only about survival, and nothing else. He walked over to his prized wine cabinet, and with great effort pried open a crack with his nail, then drank the wine that seeped out, trying to numb his mind, so he wouldn't have to think about his reality. And everything happening to him was being watched by that spider not far away. Paul, too, happened to notice the spider. Seeing his body still shrinking, he knew that if he didn't get rid of the spider soon, once he got even smaller, he'd never have a chance to fight back. He took the nail and headed toward the spider. Just as the spider was about to reach him, Paul's hand slipped and the nail fell to the floor. His foot slipped too, and he fell into the bathtub below. What happened next made Paul's skin crawl. Goldfish only a few centimeters long were swimming toward him. Luckily, these goldfish meant him no harm. They just swam back and forth around him. After Paul climbed out of the tub, he saw the spider hiding in a corner. He planned to trap the spider by covering it with a bottle cap, but the spider was sensitive to movement around it and quickly spotted Paul. Paul had to put down the cap and grab the nail, ready to fight. This time, Paul was determined to kill the spider and leave no future threat. After they fought for hours, Paul was driven into a corner. The spider knew this environment well and had the upper hand in the fight. But in the end, Paul managed to stab the spider's eye with the nail, and only just escaped this time. To keep the spider from attacking again, Paul found a match and lit a small ball of paper scraps. This little flame brought a bit of light to the dim basement, and kept the spider from coming near him easily. Several more months passed, and by now Paul had become smaller than an ant. Steps he once stepped over with a light lift of his foot were now so high he couldn't cross them at all. One day, he suddenly heard footsteps coming from upstairs. As before, he tried to shout for help, hoping to get someone's attention. But the person who came down turned out to be a real estate agent. Paul's voice was so small it couldn't reach the agent, who was on the phone. Paul was even nearly stepped on by the agent. Paul realized that during the time he'd been missing, even if his wife had searched for him at first, after so many days gone, she'd surely concluded the cat had eaten him. And this house was no longer somewhere his wife needed to keep living. Looking at the goldfish in the nearby tub, which had starved to death inside it, Paul understood his own end might be just like theirs, dying quietly, without a sound. Just as Paul was feeling hopeless about his future, a large mosquito suddenly flew up not far away. Watching the mosquito fly out through the window above, an idea came to Paul. If he could just escape this basement, he still had a chance to survive. But Paul was only about 5 millimeters tall, so climbing up to a window 3 meters high would be extremely hard. But rather than wait to die in the basement, Paul would rather die in some accident on the way to the window. He began to climb, inching upward with all his strength. For a body as small as his, just making it onto the counter above would take at least 3 days. In those 3 days, he had no chance to rest and no way to restore his strength. But through sheer willpower, on the 4th day he finally made it onto the tabletop. After resting a few hours, Paul decided to keep going. But looking at the 3-centimeter wide gap ahead, Paul knew that only by jumping across could he reach the distant window. He was dead either way. After a few seconds to prepare, Paul charged at the gap. He ran forward with all his might, and the instant he reached the edge of the gap, he leapt. After landing safely on the other side, Paul thought he could leave the basement through the window. But after only a few steps, a huge spider web blocked his path. And on the web, a spider was waiting for prey. Paul knew that forcing his way through would be suicide. He could only carefully skirt around the weakest edge of the web. He held his breath and slowed his movements to a minimum. But even so, a faint vibration still traveled along the silk. The spider in the center instantly sprang into motion and lunged at Paul. At that critical moment, a flying insect suddenly hit the other end of the web. To the spider, that was a more suitable meal. The next second, it turned and pounced on the insect instead. Having narrowly survived, Paul didn't dare linger and quickly picked up his pace. At last he reached the edge of that window. But even though his body was now smaller than an ant, the window's mesh was still too narrow for him. Paul could only wait. Once he shrank small enough to pass through the mesh, he could escape the basement. In the days of waiting, Paul gazed at the sky each day, feeling himself shrink bit by bit. He didn't know whether death or freedom would come first. He had no choice in the matter. He could only wait. This morning, Paul was woken by a sharp, intense pain. Looking down, he saw an ant gnawing at his calf. Right after, that spider appeared before Paul again, and ate those ants. Seeing the spider set its sights on him again, Paul spun around and squeezed into the window mesh. Luckily, his body had shrunk enough to slip through the mesh, and he escaped the spider's pursuit. Having made it outside, Paul saw a world utterly transformed. The once unremarkable patch of grass now looked to him like an endless primeval forest. He didn't know where his wife and daughter were, nor whether he'd ever have a chance to reunite with his family. But he knew, in the days to come,